Somewhere right now, there is a phone sitting face down on a table, and someone is staring at it, waiting, counting the minutes between the last message they sent and the reply that has not come. Their chest is tight. Their mind is spinning through a dozen possible reasons for the quiet, most of them cruel, all of them aimed at themselves. And on the other end of that silence sits someone who expected exactly this reaction. Someone who is, in this very moment, quietly satisfied that the silence is working. If this sounds uncomfortably familiar, if you have ever felt your own worth shrink in proportion to how long someone took to respond, then what you are about to hear is going to change the way you experience silence for the rest of your life. Because silence was never actually about you. It was a strategy. And once you understand the strategy, it loses almost all of its power. Let's begin with the assumption that silence carries. Somewhere deep in the human brain, quiet has always meant danger. Long before language existed, before relationships were negotiated through words, silence in a group meant a predator was near, meant safety had been disrupted, meant something required urgent attention. This ancient wiring did not disappear just because modern relationships now play out through screens and delayed replies instead of literal survival threats. When someone you care about goes quiet, especially after closeness, especially after intimacy, your nervous system does not calmly interpret that as they are simply busy. It interprets it as threat, and threat demands a response. This is why silence from someone avoidant can feel so disproportionately painful compared to silence from someone who does not matter to you. It is not weakness, it is biology being exploited by behavior. And exploited is exactly the right word, because for a person with avoidant patterns, silence is rarely accidental. It is often, whether consciously calculated or not, one of the most efficient tools available for regaining a sense of control the moment closeness starts to feel overwhelming. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Avoidant withdrawal usually intensifies right after connection deepens, not right after conflict erupts. This confuses people endlessly because logic suggests that distance should follow disagreement, follow hurt, follow something identifiably wrong. But often, the silence arrives precisely when things were going well, right after a vulnerable conversation, right after affection was expressed, right after a moment that most people would consider a relationship strengthening. That timing is not a coincidence. Closeness itself becomes the trigger, and withdrawal becomes the release valve. Let's talk about what is actually happening internally for someone who chooses silence as a response to intimacy. For many avoidant individuals, connection creates a subtle but powerful sense of exposure, an unconscious fear that being truly known also means eventually being truly abandoned or truly disappointing someone. Silence, in this context, functions almost like a pressure release. It restores a feeling of autonomy, a sense that no one currently has access to demand anything of them. This is rarely done with malicious intent in the way it might look from the outside. It is defensive, not offensive, even though the effect on the person left waiting can feel identical to an attack. But here is where the psychology gets more layered. And this is important because understanding this next part will completely reframe how you interpret the silence you may have experienced. Many avoidant individuals develop, somewhere along the way, an implicit understanding that their withdrawal produces a predictable reaction in others: anxiety, pursuit, reassurance seeking. And while this understanding is not always conscious or strategic in a calculated sense, it becomes reinforced over time, simply through repetition. Withdraw, watch the other person become anxious, watch that anxiety translate into increased effort, increased warmth, increased attention directed towards soothing the avoidant partner's discomfort. This creates an unspoken pattern where distance becomes, paradoxically, a way of generating closeness on their own terms. Closeness that feels safer because it was earned through absence rather than requested through vulnerability. This means the silence you experienced may not have simply been a side effect of their internal fear. It may have functioned, intentionally or not, as a lever, one that reliably produced a specific outcome, your energy, your attention, your emotional labor, directed entirely toward restoring the connection they pulled away from. And if that lever worked once, it becomes far more likely to be used again. Not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of the simple human tendency to repeat whatever produces a predictable, desired result. I want to pause here and validate something important, because this realization can feel disorienting, even a little humiliating in retrospect. If you spent time desperately trying to understand silence, replaying conversations, questioning your own worth, sending message after message trying to fix something you could not even clearly identify, that response does not reveal a flaw in your character. It reveals the effectiveness of a psychological mechanism that has worked on countless people before you. People who were intelligent, self-aware, and emotionally mature in every other area of their lives. The fact that this pattern affected you does not mean you were foolish. It means you were human, responding exactly the way most humans are wired to respond to sudden emotional absence from someone who previously represented safety. Let's explore the specific texture of this kind of silence more closely, because it rarely feels like ordinary distance. It often carries a strange charge, an unspoken tension that makes the absence louder than actual words would be. This happens because silence, unlike explicit rejection, leaves room for imagination. And imagination, when left unchecked by clear information, almost always defaults toward the worst possible interpretation. A person could be withdrawing simply because they feel emotionally overwhelmed, needing space to regulate an internal storm that has nothing to do with your worth. But without any communication accompanying that withdrawal, the mind left waiting fills the void with self-blame, imagining betrayal, imagining rejection, imagining 100 failures that may not even exist. This is precisely why silence feels so much more devastating than an honest, even if painful, explanation would feel. Ambiguity is heavier than truth, almost every single time. Now let's talk about power, because silence, whether intended this way or not, functions as one of the most potent forms of relational power available. Consider what actually happens during a period of unexplained absence. The person withdrawing retains complete control over the timeline. They decide when contact resumes. They decide the tone of that contact. They decide whether an explanation will ever be offered at all. Meanwhile, the person left waiting exists in a state of complete powerlessness, unable to influence the outcome no matter how much energy they pour into worry, analysis, or attempts to reach out. This imbalance is not accidental. Even when someone withdrawing genuinely believes they are simply protecting themselves, the practical effect of their silence is a total consolidation of control over the relationship's rhythm, leaving the other person with nothing to do but wait and hope. This is worth repeating in a different way, because it deserves emphasis. Silence transfers power. Every single time someone withdraws without explanation, they are, whether they intend it this way or not, placing themselves in the position of decision maker, while placing you in the position of dependent. Recognizing this dynamic clearly is one of the most important steps toward reclaiming your own emotional stability, because once you see the mechanics of the imbalance, you stop mistaking your anxious waiting for love, and start recognizing it instead as a predictable response to an imbalance of control that was never fair to begin with. Let's talk now about what silence actually costs the person doing the withdrawing, because this often gets overlooked entirely. Avoidant individuals frequently believe silence is protecting them, shielding their inner world from exposure, preserving a sense of independence. But silence, especially prolonged silence, actually deepens the very isolation that likely contributed to their avoidant patterns in the first place. Every time they choose distance over vulnerability, they reinforce a belief system that closeness is dangerous, and this reinforcement makes future intimacy even harder to access, not easier. In other words, the very strategy meant to protect that from the discomfort of vulnerability actually strengthens the wall that prevents them from ever fully experiencing safe, reciprocal connection. Silence is not a neutral pause. It is a repeated vote for isolation, cast again and again, until isolation starts to feel like identity rather than choice. This matters for you because it reframes something crucial. Their silence was never proof that you were too much, too needy, too intense, or unworthy of communication. Their silence was evidence of an internal architecture built long before you arrived, a pattern that would have activated with almost anyone who got close enough to trigger it. You did not create this dynamic. You simply happened to be standing close enough to witness it in motion. Let's talk about the specific kind of anxiety that silence produces, because it is worth naming clearly rather than leaving it vague. This anxiety often manifests physically before it manifests as coherent thought. A tightening in the stomach, restlessness that makes ordinary tasks feel impossible to focus on, checking a phone repeatedly, not out of impatience, but out of something closer to compulsion, an attempt to regain some small sense of control over an uncontrollable situation. This experience mirrors, almost exactly, patterns studied in behavioral psychology around variable reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes unpredictable rewards more compelling than consistent ones. When contact resumes unpredictably, after periods of unexplained silence, the brain treats that resumed contact as a significant reward, releasing a surge of relief and pleasure disproportionate to what a stable, predictable relationship would ever produce. This means the silence itself, painful as it is, actually intensifies the emotional impact of eventual contact, creating a cycle that feels compelling specifically because of the instability, not despite it. Understanding this mechanism robs it of its illusion. What feels like undeniable chemistry, an inexplicable pull back towards someone the moment they finally respond, is very often simply the brain's chemical relief response to an anxiety it endured during the silence. That relief gets misattributed to the relationship itself, when in reality, it may be nothing more than a nervous system finally exhaling after being held in suspended tension. Mistaking that relief for love is one of the most common and most painful confusions in relationships involving avoidant patterns. Let's talk about self-worth now, because silence, repeated often enough, does something quiet and corrosive to a person's internal sense of value. Over time, unanswered messages and unexplained absences begin to feel like evidence, even though they are not actually evidence of anything factual about your worth. The mind, desperate for explanation, often settles on the most self-critical narrative available, because blaming yourself at least offers a sense of control. If it was your fault, then theoretically you could fix it, behave differently, become more appealing, and the silence would stop. This belief, though understandable, is deeply mistaken. Silence driven by avoidant patterns is rarely something you can behave your way out of, because the trigger is not your behavior. The trigger is closeness itself, and closeness cannot be avoided without abandoning the relationship entirely. I want to be direct here, because this deserves clarity rather than gentle vagueness. You did not cause someone's silence through insufficient charm, insufficient patience, or insufficient understanding. Silence originating from avoidant patterns exists independent of your effort, and no amount of adjusting your own behavior will reliably prevent it, because the mechanism triggering it lives inside their history, not inside your actions. Let's shift now toward a metaphor that might help clarify this dynamic further. Picture someone standing at the edge of a swimming pool, someone who was once, long ago, pulled underwater unexpectedly and nearly drowned. Now, every time water rises past their ankles, their body reacts with alarm, regardless of how calm the water actually is, regardless of how safe the pool currently happens to be. Their retreat from the water is not a judgment about the water itself. It is a memory, resurfacing automatically, disconnected from present reality. Silence from an avoidant partner often works the same way. Their retreat is rarely a judgment about you specifically. It is often an old memory of danger, surfacing the moment emotional water rises past a certain depth, regardless of how safe your presence actually is in that moment. This metaphor matters because it shifts the emotional weight away from personal rejection and toward pattern recognition. You are not the water that hurt them originally. You are simply the current water, close enough to trigger memory of an old wound that has nothing to do with your character. Let's talk about what actually helps in these situations. Not from a place of trying to fix someone else's patterns, because that responsibility was never yours to carry, but from a place of protecting your own peace, regardless of what they choose to do. The first and most important shift involves separating their silence from your own self narrative. Silence is information about them. It is not information about your worth. Every time silence arrives, and every time the mind reaches instinctively for self blame, there is an opportunity to interrupt that reflex, gently, without harshness, simply by asking whether this conclusion is actually supported by evidence or whether it is simply the oldest, most familiar story the mind knows how to tell during moments of uncertainty. Let's talk about communication, because there is a meaningful difference between chasing someone through silence and clearly stating your own needs once, calmly, without escalating pursuit into desperation. There is nothing wrong with expressing that unexplained silence is difficult for you, that you would appreciate honesty over disappearance, that ongoing patterns of unexplained withdrawal are not sustainable for your own well-being. This is not manipulation. This is simply honest communication about your own limits. What matters most is not whether they respond well to this honesty, but whether you deliver it once, clearly, and then observe what happens next, rather than repeating the same plea multiple times in escalating desperation, which often only reinforces the exact power imbalance we discussed earlier. Let's talk about the difference between space and disappearance, because this distinction gets blurred constantly, and clarity here can prevent enormous confusion. Healthy space involves communication, even brief communication, something as simple as acknowledging a need for time, without demanding total silence. Disappearance, by contrast, offers zero information, leaving the other person to construct an entire narrative alone, without any input from the person actually causing the confusion. Someone capable of healthy relationships can learn to ask for space while still maintaining basic communication. Someone relying purely on disappearance as a coping mechanism is, whether consciously or not, choosing control over consideration, prioritizing their own comfort completely over your basic need for information. This distinction matters enormously when evaluating whether a pattern is likely to shift over time. Space accompanied by communication suggests someone capable of growth, someone willing to balance their own needs against yours. Disappearance without any acknowledgement suggests a pattern far less likely to change without significant internal work that cannot be rushed, cannot be requested into existence, and certainly cannot be produced simply by loving them more intensely or waiting more patiently. Let's talk about hypervigilance, because prolonged exposure to unpredictable silence often creates a lingering state of alertness that persists even during periods of calm. This means that even when things seem fine, some part of the nervous system remains braced for the next disappearance, scanning constantly for warning signs, treating even minor delays in response as potential threats. This state is exhausting, and it is worth naming clearly because so many people blame themselves for feeling anxious, even during good moments, without realizing that hypervigilance is simply the nervous system doing exactly what repeated unpredictability trained it to do. This is not a personality flaw. It is a conditioned response. And conditioned responses, while uncomfortable, can be gradually retrained through consistent, safe experiences over time, ideally with a partner capable of providing the steadiness that silence previously denied. Let's talk about the specific fear that keeps so many people trapped inside this dynamic. The fear that speaking up about the pain silence causes will simply drive the other person further away, confirming the very abandonment being feared in the first place. This fear creates a paralyzing bind, where staying silent about your own hurt feels safer than risking additional distance, even though staying silent often means absorbing repeated harm without ever addressing it. Breaking this bind requires accepting an uncomfortable truth. If honestly expressing a reasonable need causes someone to disappear entirely, that disappearance was likely coming regardless, simply delayed by your continued silence about your own pain. Speaking honestly does not create instability that did not already exist. It simply reveals instability that was already present, sooner rather than later, which ultimately serves you far better than prolonged uncertainty ever could. Let's talk about identity now, because prolonged exposure to unpredictable silence often erodes a person's sense of their own reliability as a judge of reality. When someone repeatedly withdraws without explanation, and when questions about that withdrawal are met with vagueness, minimization, or irritation rather than honest answers, the person left waiting often begins doubting their own perception entirely. Was that silence really as long as it felt? Was I really as hurt as I remember being? Am I overreacting to something that most people would simply shrug off? This erosion of self trust is one of the most damaging long term effects of repeated, unexplained withdrawal, because it does not simply affect the current relationship, it follows a person into future relationships, creating a persistent uncertainty about whether their own emotional responses can be trusted at all. Rebuilding this trust requires deliberately honoring your own perception, even in small ways, even when no one else is available to validate it. If silence felt painful, it was painful, regardless of whether the other person ever acknowledges that impact. Your emotional experience does not require external validation in order to be real, and learning to trust your own internal experience, independent of anyone else's willingness to confirm it, is one of the most powerful forms of healing available after prolonged exposure to unpredictable emotional absence. Let's talk about grief, because underneath the analysis, underneath the pattern recognition, there is often simply grief. Grief for a version of closeness that felt just out of reach. Grief for the emotional safety that silence repeatedly interrupted. Grief for the energy spent trying to interpret absence instead of simply being met with presence. This grief deserves acknowledgement rather than immediate problem solving. It is allowed to exist fully without rushing toward resolution, because grief that is honored tends to move through a person more completely than grief that gets bypassed in favor of quick fixes or a forced positivity. Let's talk about what safety would actually feel like, in contrast to what you may have experienced. Safety in a relationship does not require constant contact or constant reassurance. It simply requires predictability, a basic sense that even during necessary space, communication remains available, rather than completely withdrawn. Safety means that even during disagreement, silence is not weaponized as a form of punishment or control. Safety means that vulnerability, once shared, is met with steadiness, rather than sudden retreat. If this description feels foreign, almost unfamiliar compared to what you have experienced, that unfamiliarity is not a sign that safety does not exist. It is simply a sign of how thoroughly instability became normalized within the relationship you are now examining. Let's talk about the specific trap of interpreting silence as evidence of depth, a trap that catches many people without them even realizing it is happening. There is a strange cultural tendency to associate emotional intensity with meaningfulness, to believe that a relationship filled with anxious waiting and dramatic reunions must be more significant than one built on steady, uneventful consistency. This belief deserves direct challenge. Intensity is not the same as depth. Chaos is not the same as connection. A relationship that requires constant emotional labor simply to maintain basic stability is not more meaningful than one that simply feels calm. It is often simply more exhausting, mistaken for meaningful only because exhaustion demands so much attention that it starts to feel important by sheer volume of energy spent. Let's talk about the future now, because healing from this pattern requires more than understanding it intellectually. It requires practicing new responses, deliberately, even when old instincts pull toward familiar anxiety. This means noticing the urge to interpret silence as personal failure, and choosing instead to interpret it as information about someone else's internal state, information that may or may not have anything meaningful to do with your worth. It means practicing patience with your own healing process, understanding that nervous systems retrain slowly, through repetition, not through a single moment of clarity, however powerful that moment might feel in the instant it arrives. Let's talk now about something rarely discussed openly: the specific way silence interacts with a person's sense of time. During periods of unexplained absence, time itself seems to distort. An hour without a reply can feel like an entire afternoon lost to worry. A single day of silence can feel like an eternity stretched across the mind, every passing minute recalculating the odds of abandonment versus reassurance. This distortion is not imagined weakness. It reflects a genuine neurological reality, because uncertainty activates threat monitoring systems that consume enormous mental energy, making ordinary time feel elongated and unbearable. Understanding this helps explain why silence from someone who matters can feel so disproportionately devastating compared to silence from someone whose opinion holds little weight. The nervous system is not measuring literal hours, it is measuring perceived threat, and perceived threat warps time in ways that logic alone cannot easily correct. Let's talk about the aftermath of silence too, because the moment contact resumes is rarely as simple as relief. Often there is a strange collision of emotions: gratitude that the waiting has ended, mixed uncomfortably with resentment that the waiting was ever necessary in the first place, mixed further with a kind of self-conscious embarrassment about how much energy was spent worrying over something the other person may barely have registered as significant. This emotional collision is confusing, precisely because it contains contradictions that refuse to resolve neatly. You can feel relieved and furious at the same time. You can feel grateful for contact and quietly aware that gratitude for basic communication is itself a sign that something in the dynamic has become distorted. Noticing this contradiction without forcing it into a single tidy feeling is part of learning to trust your own emotional complexity, rather than simplifying it into something more convenient. Let's talk about the specific role that unpredictability plays in deepening attachment, because this deserves careful unpacking beyond what we touched on earlier. When rewards arrive predictably, the brain processes them pleasantly, but without much lasting intensity, because predictability signals safety, and safety, while wonderful for long-term well-being, does not generate the same urgent craving that unpredictability produces. Unpredictable reward schedules, by contrast, create a heightened state of anticipation that persists even during the absence of reward, because the brain remains uncertain about when the next positive moment will arrive. This uncertainty keeps attention locked onto the source of unpredictability, almost like a low-grade obsession that never fully resolves. This mechanism explains why relationships marked by inconsistent communication can feel more consuming, more difficult to release mentally, than relationships built on steady reliability, even when the steady relationship would objectively provide a healthier, more sustainable foundation for long-term happiness. This is worth repeating clearly, because it reframes an experience many people quietly blame themselves for. If you have found it difficult to stop thinking about someone whose communication was unpredictable, that difficulty is not proof of unusually strong feelings for that specific person. It is often simply proof that unpredictability itself creates a particularly persistent kind of mental preoccupation, regardless of who is causing it. Recognizing this mechanism allows you to separate the intensity of your preoccupation from any conclusion about how right or healthy the relationship actually was. Let's talk about apology dynamics, because when silence eventually breaks and communication resumes, what follows the silence matters enormously, often more than the silence itself. There is a significant difference between someone who acknowledges the impact of their absence openly, without minimizing your experience, and someone who resumes contact as though nothing happened at all, expecting warmth to simply pick up exactly where it left off. This second pattern deserves particular attention, because it quietly teaches the person waiting that their pain during the silence was irrelevant, unworthy of even brief acknowledgement. Over time, this teaches a corrosive lesson: that your emotional experience matters less than maintaining a comfortable atmosphere for the person who caused the discomfort in the first place. Watching for this pattern, the presence or absence of acknowledgement following silence, offers one of the clearest windows available into whether a relationship is likely to remain balanced or continue tilting toward one person's comfort at the expense of the other's well-being. Let's talk about the internal experience of someone who relies on silence as a coping mechanism, because understanding their internal world further dissolves the temptation towards self-blame. For many avoidant individuals, emotional overwhelm does not register consciously as overwhelm. It often registers instead as irritation, restlessness, or a vague desire to be somewhere else entirely. Sensations that get resolved through withdrawal before the person even fully understands why they feel the need to withdraw. This means their silence is frequently not a calculated punishment aimed deliberately at you, but rather an automatic escape from an internal sensation they have not yet learned to identify, tolerate, or communicate clearly. This does not excuse the impact of their behavior, because impact matters regardless of intention. But understanding this mechanism can help soften the harshest interpretations, the ones that assume deliberate cruelty, where automatic avoidance is actually the more accurate explanation. Let's talk about boundaries again, because boundaries around silence specifically require a particular kind of clarity that differs from boundaries around other behaviors. A boundary here might sound like stating plainly that ongoing communication, even brief communication acknowledging a need for space, matters more to you than perfect availability at all times. This boundary does not demand constant contact. It simply demands the basic courtesy of not disappearing entirely without any signal at all. Stating this boundary clearly, once, and observing whether it gets respected over time provides invaluable information about whether someone is capable of adjusting their patterns in response to your genuine needs, or whether your needs will continue to be treated as secondary to their comfort regardless of how clearly you express them. Let's talk about what happens when this boundary gets tested repeatedly and fails, because this scenario deserves direct acknowledgement rather than vague optimism. If someone continues disappearing without acknowledgement after a clear boundary has been communicated, this repetition itself is the answer to a question you may still be quietly asking yourself, the question of whether they are capable of change. Repeated failure to honor a clearly stated, reasonable boundary is not evidence that you asked incorrectly, or that you need to phrase things more gently, or that you simply have not been patient enough yet. It is evidence that, at least currently, their capacity for consistent communication has not caught up to the level of consideration a healthy relationship actually requires. This is painful information, but painful information delivered clearly is far more valuable than comfortable ambiguity that keeps you waiting indefinitely for change that may never fully arrive. Let's talk about your own healing, apart from this specific relationship, because the patterns discussed here, once recognized, tend to become visible in other areas of life as well, not just in romantic connections. Perhaps you have noticed similar anxiety around delayed responses from friends, similar self-doubt when a family member goes quiet unexpectedly, similar tendency to interpret ordinary silence from anyone as a referendum on your worth. This is worth noticing, not with self-criticism, but with curiosity, because it often points toward an earlier root, a formative experience where silence first became associated with danger, long before this particular relationship ever began. Healing this deeper root does more than resolve confusion about one specific person. It changes your relationship with silence itself, in every context, for the rest of your life. Let's talk finally about what steady, secure connection actually feels like once this pattern has been unlearned, because healing needs a destination, not just an escape from what hurt. Steady connection feels, at first, almost suspiciously calm, because the nervous system has become so accustomed to monitoring for threat that the absence of threat can initially feel unfamiliar, even slightly unsettling. Over time, this unfamiliarity fades, replaced by a new baseline, where silence simply means someone is busy, or resting, or living their life, without any hidden meaning requiring urgent decoding. Reaching this baseline is not instant. It develops gradually through repeated experiences of consistency proving itself trustworthy, until the old alarm system finally learns that not every quiet moment signals abandonment. Let's talk about something that rarely gets named directly: the specific loneliness of being physically present in a relationship while emotionally starved of communication. This loneliness differs from the loneliness of simply being single because it carries an added layer of confusion. You are not alone in the sense of lacking a partner. You are alone in the sense of lacking access, present in someone's life without being granted entry into their inner world, close enough to feel the outline of connection without ever fully touching its center. This particular flavor of loneliness is exhausting in a way that pure solitude is not, because solitude at least offers clarity. This kind of company without communication offers only ongoing ambiguity, a perpetual reaching towards something that keeps receding just as it seems within reach. Let's talk about the specific cognitive toll this takes over extended periods, because it deserves serious acknowledgement rather than being dismissed as simple worry. Constantly monitoring someone else's mood, constantly parsing tone in short messages, constantly rehearsing potential explanations for silence consumes enormous mental bandwidth. Bandwidth that could otherwise be directed toward your own goals, your own creativity, your own rest. Many people who have lived through repeated cycles of unexplained silence report feeling mentally foggy, unable to concentrate fully on work or hobbies, because a portion of their attention remains permanently allocated toward monitoring an unpredictable variable. This is not a personal failing in focus or discipline. It is the direct cost of living inside chronic uncertainty, a cost that only becomes visible once removed from the situation entirely, when the sudden return of mental clarity reveals just how much energy had quietly been diverted the entire time. Let's talk about comparison, because silence often triggers a specific kind of comparison that deserves direct examination. During periods of unexplained absence, many people begin comparing themselves unfavorably to imagined rivals, wondering if someone else has captured the attention that has been withdrawn from them, wondering if they simply were not interesting enough, attractive enough, easy enough to be around. This comparison is almost always inaccurate because it assumes the withdrawal reflects a preference for someone or something else, when in reality, the withdrawal usually reflects an internal retreat that has little to do with external comparison at all. The avoidant mind is not typically weighing you against alternatives during silence. It is often simply seeking relief from internal pressure that exists regardless of who else might be present in their life. Recognizing this can quiet a particularly painful and usually inaccurate narrative that tends to compound the original hurt of silence with additional, unnecessary self-doubt. Let's talk about the specific way hope operates during silence, because hope here behaves differently than hope in most other areas of life. Ordinary hope typically responds to evidence, growing stronger when circumstances improve and weakening when circumstances worsen. But hope during periods of unexplained silence often behaves almost independently of evidence, sustained instead by memory, by the residue of previous good moments that get replayed mentally until they feel more vivid and more convincing than the current absence itself. This is why silence can persist for extended periods without fully extinguishing hope, because the mind keeps drawing from an emotional reserve built during earlier, better moments, spending down that reserve slowly, refusing to acknowledge that the reserve is not being replenished by anything currently happening in the present. Understanding this mechanism helps explain why leaving a pattern like this can feel so much harder than logic would suggest it should. You are not simply choosing to release a person. You are choosing to stop drawing from a reserve of memory that, however outdated, still feels emotionally real every time it gets accessed. Depleting that reserve fully, allowing old memories to finally lose their grip on present decision-making, takes deliberate effort, often requiring conscious redirection away from replaying good moments and toward honestly acknowledging the full pattern, including the silence, including the confusion, including the exhaustion that accompanied those good moments just as consistently. Let's talk about the particular vulnerability created by explaining yourself repeatedly, because this deserves careful attention too. In dynamics marked by unpredictable silence, many people fall into a habit of over explaining their own reactions, apologizing preemptively for feeling hurt, softening reasonable requests until they barely resemble requests at all, out of fear that directness will trigger further withdrawal. This habit, understandable as a survival strategy within an unpredictable dynamic, slowly erodes a person's ability to state their needs plainly in any relationship, not just this one. Recovering the ability to state needs without excessive qualification, without pre apologizing for having feelings at all, is one of the quieter but most important aspects of healing from repeated exposure to unpredictable silence. Let's talk about what accountability actually requires from someone who has used silence repeatedly as a coping mechanism, because this offers a useful measuring stick for anyone currently trying to determine whether change is genuinely occurring. Real accountability requires more than a single apology after the fact. It requires proactive communication before withdrawal becomes prolonged, a willingness to say plainly that space is needed rather than simply vanishing without any signal at all. It requires tolerance for the discomfort of being asked direct questions about the withdrawal, rather than treating those questions as unfair accusations. It requires consistency over an extended period, not simply a single instance of improved communication offered during a moment when the relationship feels at risk of ending entirely. Without these elements present consistently, what looks like accountability is often simply damage control, offered temporarily to reduce immediate tension rather than reflecting any deeper shift in capacity.